of power in this country. Her program relates the news of the week to emerging evidence about the conspiracy which allegedly maintains by force its control of the legislative, executive, and judicial processes in America. And now, Mae Brussell.
Good afternoon. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. Dialogue Conspiracy number 250, and it's January 3rd, 1976. I thought I would begin the program by listing a few of the subjects that we will be talking about on Dialogue Conspiracy during 1977. I'm sorry, it's 1977, first week of 1977. And most of the subjects that I will be talking about for the months to come will be a continuation of episodes or news events that were created in the past years but which are left unsolved and still must be exposed to their fullest, including such matters as the kidnapping of Patty Hearst and the Watergate story, which never did go into the Howard Hughes angle, or the deaths that were involved in the Watergate case. There is no way to predict some events that will be taking place in the future, but there's one thing that I'm very sure of, and that is that the news media is in the hands of a very few, and that they do control events that become newsworthy in their own right. I'm thinking of unpredictable circumstances this year that created, for example, the Korean tree incident. And I time it with other events that could be the cause of that killing of two people in Korea, the borderline between South and North Korea. The night that Gerald Ford was nominated for President of the United States was the same time that the story of the Korean tree incident broke, and there happened to be cameras there conveniently taking pictures of this event, and immediately the Army and Navy was sent in, and Gerald Ford began his speech of being hard on commies and sending in these troops, air and land and sea, to fortify the defenses of the, in quotes, free world. And the South Korean incident also was timed with a trial that was taking place. Our government heavily funds the leader of that fascist dictatorship in South Korea, and he had a trial against certain persons, poets, and more civil libertarians, and they were going to get a stiff sentence. And the tree incident took place just at the time of their sentencing, which would soften the blow of a hard fascist-type imprisonment of these various people by creating an incident to show how bad North Korea was. And the provocations were all set up. North Korea had word that there was going to be an incident. The airplanes had been flying overhead. And the point of it is that the incident took place just at the time of the sentencing of these people, and also when Gerald Ford was nominated for president. And I believe that as soon as it was exposed how it was planned and arranged, the whole incident dropped off the news, but it did give Gerald Ford a chance to come on as a strong leader defending the free world, allegedly the free world, in that incident. And then a month later was Jimmy Carter's nomination, and as soon as he was nominated as the Democratic candidate at the conventions, it was synchronized with the kidnapping in Chowchilla. 26 school children, the bus driver, were kidnapped, and it took Jimmy Carter off the front pages. A lot of interviews were removed, and the evening news where his victory would be discussed more openly was not the news item, it was the Chowchilla kidnapping. And I have copies of newspapers from Sonora, California now of a particular person who is in San Quentin at the time the Chowchilla children were kidnapped. And he said that he knew of the plan in advance, and that these same people, he gave a physical description of some of the persons involved. He said he knew them, he heard them making the plans. It involved a rock quarry. And as soon as the children were kidnapped and later discovered at the rock quarry, the information of this particular person was hushed up and ignored. But there was also indications that there was a mastermind behind this and a woman involved. And all of this disappeared. The main thing was that Jimmy Carter's speeches, his interviews, the chance for the headlines didn't make the news, but the Chowchilla event, which had been planned in advance and people knew had been planned in advance for reasons that I've discussed on KLB before, was timed the exact time that Jimmy Carter won his nomination. So in one case, Gerald Ford gets the news and can get right in on the Korean incident. In the other case, Carter gets off the news and the Chowchilla takes over. Another unpredictable news event this year was the swine flu vaccine, which took place after an alleged case of swine flu at Fort Dix, New Jersey. And even that has been questioned as an actual case of swine flu or whether that person died of pneumonia. But this began a mass inoculation of persons across the United States who were to submit themselves to government inoculation. And it also inaugurated that Germ Disease Control Center down in Atlanta, Georgia, which takes the medical situation in this country away from civilian doctors. And we have a command headquarters, like a space headquarters, that tells us when to get shots and when not to get shots. And as they were making their swine flu vaccine without any real hard evidence that there would be a swine flu, the Legionnaire disease took place in Philadelphia. Now, each one of these things brought much news coverage in terms of TV, radio, and the printed page. I have just literally hundreds of articles on each of these things, and they took from real events in the news that should have been exposed. They took priority, and they also are important in affecting our future lives. Legionnaire disease turned out not to be a disease at all. It's a toxic poisoning, and the symptoms were identical to the same toxic poisoning that had been tested at Fort Derrick, Maryland by the CIA. And the Army and the command center down in Georgia missed the diagnosis on these things because they were looking for a disease similar to the swine flu. And that took a lot of news coverage this last year. And Gary Gilmore's request in Salt Lake City to die by a firing squad also has been taking front page news. And as soon as the links of Gary Gilmore to the CIA, to his attorney, the authors of his book, and the medical records began to surface, or the request for them began to surface, of his psychiatric condition, or who saw him, or what was his treatment or condition before he asked to be killed by a firing squad, or before he killed two people beyond his own control, as if hypnotized, and he suggested that he was in that condition. As soon as that began to surface, and people from London and all over the world came into Salt Lake City, that went off the news. But Gary Gilmore took a lot of publicity, and he will bring back the death penalty unless something drastic happens. In January, he'll be shot by a firing squad, drinking his Coors beer. His ad for Coors beer is six-pack, and he will be killed. And these were all political events that took a lot of news this last year, and those are the unpredictable events that we'll be talking about. Incidentally, the death penalty is a very convenient way for people who plan conspiracies to do away with their patsies. There's a woman in New York City, a radio woman, used to be a model, Candy Jones, that I've talked before about on KLRB. There's a book out about her called The Control of Candy Jones, and in it, Candy said that she was hypnotized in Carmel, California, at a special school here in our hometown to learn to hate and to get some hypnotic treatment. And last week, since I was on Dialogue Conspiracy, Candy Jones was in New York radio, the AM radio station, and gave an interview and said that Sirhan was also hypnotized in Carmel, California, at the same school that she attended a few years earlier. So one of the big pressures of death penalty, one of the arguments I've always had, was if you kill James Earl Ray, if you kill Sirhan, or even someone like Gary Gilmore, you can't really know who was behind their operations, or if Gilmore really wanted to die, or who was doing the hypnotizing. You can always reprogram somebody or get them out of the trance with the proper handling, but if they're dead, then the case is closed. Another example is James Earl Ray, the alleged assassin of Martin Luther King. The headlines this week all over the Associated Press, the United Press, finally are saying that there's a conspiracy involved in James Earl Ray's case, and it goes as far as to Portugal, where he was getting advice on what to do and where to travel next. And yet our Attorney General in California, Evel Younger, has pushed night and day for the death penalty, and people like Charles Manson and Sirhan would be murdered, then we never would get the true story of who was behind the killing of Robert Kennedy or the massacres in California. So Gilmore serves a very strategic purpose in getting the death penalty rolling again, because once he's killed, there may be many patsies among the 200 or 300 waiting on death row now, even if there's 25 who are innocent and the criminals are at large and they were political murders for a particular district attorney or a judge or a law enforcement agency. And they have been used, murders have been used to catapult these people into prominence, particularly at election time, and to promote their career. So the death penalty is a no-no as far as I'm concerned. I don't like it in any instance, but in these political assassinations, it's particularly important to keep the patsies alive. So this last year, the unpredictable news that interfered with a lot of material I would like to talk about continuously were things like the Korean tree incident, the Legionnaire's disease, the swine flu, the Gilmore case. And I do know that through 1977 we will have a lot more of these unpredictable cataclysmic events to discuss. On Dialogue Conspiracy, I will be talking as much as I can, as often as I can, about the congressional investigation taking place in Washington, D.C. into the assassination of John Kennedy and Reverend Martin Luther King. I've said many times on this program and where I speak publicly that I do not have trust in the committee in Washington that is running this investigation. They're a small group. They're as secret as the original Warren Commission group. They consist of persons from the FBI and CIA. The new group, after Congress reconvenes and Jimmy Carter as President of the United States, will be headed by Congressman Henry Gonzalez. He isn't the person to be heading this group, I don't believe. He was the recipient of John Connally's clothing, his pants, his shirt, his coat, the day that John Connally was shot and almost died, November 22nd, 1963. And I don't think that a member of Congress who sat with Lyndon Johnson, who the nurses trusted enough to hand these bloody clothing that are a piece of hard evidence in a homicide where 2 or 3 people were to be killed, or 2 killed and 1 almost died. I don't think that a man that was confident enough to receive this and take that clothing out of Texas to Washington, D.C., to his apartment, where it was then allowed to be dry cleaned as evidence, I don't think of all the members in Congress, 600 members in Congress, that a man like Henry Gonzalez should be allowed to investigate this Kennedy assassination until he's the first witness to explain why he took those clothing or why they weren't handed to the police or the Secret Service or the FBI. Another matter is Richard Sprague. He's the attorney that's been selected from Philadelphia, handpicked by Mark Lane and a few others to open up the investigation as a special prosecutor. I can't go along with that. Mr. Sprague has worked with Arlene Specter for 10 years, and Specter was on the Warren Commission, and he devised that phony story of Bullet 399, the single bullet theory that killed John Kennedy, where there actually was a crossfire of as many as 6 to 10 bullets, and that isn't new evidence. It could have been discovered immediately. I don't believe that I could possibly trust Mr. Specter. He says he never asked, Mr. Specter of the CIA never talked with Richard Sprague about the Kennedy assassination, the 10 years they worked together. But I can't believe that. I never will believe it. And I believe of all the attorneys in the United States, and I don't know how many there are and how many states, we have 50 states and hundreds of attorneys, to go to an attorney that works in the law office with Arlene Specter to open up a $6 million investigation of who killed John Kennedy and Reverend Martin Luther King. They could have gone to some office where nobody had any contact with the staff of the Warren Commission before. There's an enclave of people back there that we'll be talking about each week on Dialogue Conspiracy. I'll talk for 5 or 10 minutes to keep you up to date each week on what's going on in Washington, D.C., because the enclave there is controlled by the Central Intelligence Agency. People like Bernard Fensterwald, who's James McCord's attorney and has links to the CIA in Washington, D.C., his law partners in the CIA, and his clients are from the CIA, and people selecting the staff are from the CIA. So we have to expose this committee constantly. I've been alerted to these people for the last few years doing my research, and I'll do everything I can to inform the listeners what's going on in Washington. I do not believe in organizations per se, but I believe it's time to form one organization, which I'm doing now and trying to spearhead, called the Real Researchers. And we're going to have our first meeting in New York City in February of this year. We're planning it now. A 3-day conference of people who have really done the hard work, people like Sherman Skolnick from Chicago, Ted Gandolfo from New York City, and John Judge from Philadelphia, and Ted Chirac. Hopefully he'll be there talking about the Robert Kennedy assassination. And Bob Cutler will talk about the Chappaquiddick affair, and Robert Salant about the Wallace shooting. And what we're planning is a 3-day conference, which I will report back to you, which will be the beginning of an organization of people who share all information, who get all the truth out, and we will have a network of correspondence and tape cassettes, and we will constantly watch the committee in Washington and watch every direction they're going. Up till now, the committee in Washington that has been investigating the assassinations went to Mexico City. Their first job was to look up some dry leads of Lee Harvey Oswald that he allegedly went to the Cuban embassy in Mexico City. They're spending their time and money on the Oswald-Cuban connections, which is a waste of taxpayers' money because they're looking for the wrong thing. The Mexican connections of Lee Harvey Oswald were very important. They were vital. But the important thing to know about Mexico is, remember at the time of Watergate, the money that was funded to Watergate went from Mexico to Houston, Texas, to Washington, D.C., and then to Florida, and back into the pockets of people like Frank Sturgis and Bernard Barker and E. Howard Hunt and members of the Bay of Pigs operation that were involved in the Kennedy assassination. The Mexican money, the Kennedy assassination, are all tangled together, and they're CIA money. Howard Hughes was taken to Mexico to die because, according to some aides, they could control the Mexican authorities, and they didn't want him to die in the Bahamas or in Britain, London, or Vancouver. They could control the situation in Mexico. Howard Hunt was in Mexico in the fall of 1963, the same month that Lee Harvey Oswald was there. And Oswald traveled with Albert Osborne, an agent of the Defense Intelligence Agency. That was his bus companion, and an agent from the CIA. And Clay Shaw from New Orleans was in Mexico City with his links to World War II Nazis that worked in the United States and Europe, and links to the Kennedy assassination. The Mexican connections of Albert Osborne, Lee Harvey Oswald, E. Howard Hunt are very important, and Mexico is important, but this committee isn't going into the link of Albert Osborne, and they're not going into what E. Howard Hunt was doing in Mexico. You see, if I were spending the $150,000 that they got to start, or they're asking Congress for $6 million, I would call E. Howard Hunt from his cell at the Air Force Base down in Florida and have him say under oath what he was doing in Mexico City as a CIA officer, at that time working for Allen Dulles for Domestic Operations Division. He left the Domestic Division, which is illegal anyway to be working in the United States domestically, went to Mexico for September and October. When Lee Harvey Oswald was down there, he would be the first witness if I were running the campaign. Also, James Earl Ray offered to testify before the Congressional Committee. He wrote to the New York Times, and he wrote to another newspaper this week, and he wrote over the head of his lawyer. His lawyer is Jim Laser, who works with Bernard Fensterwald and Mark Lane, and Laser made the statement, "I'll never let my client testify before the Congressional Committee." Now, this is such a conflict of interest. Laser, if he weren't working with the CIA, would allegedly or supposedly want James Earl Ray to tell everything he knows. But the very man who's been working with the assassination researchers in Washington, D.C., like Paul Hawk and Mark Lane and Bernard Fensterwald, doesn't want his client, James Earl Ray, to testify before the committee. And James Earl Ray has said that the FBI and the Memphis police were involved in the conspiracy that framed him. And he's been writing to the news media, to newspapers, for help. And his own lawyer won't let him out of the bind to testify, so that he's held down, literally chained as a prisoner. And that's why those people in Washington can't be trusted. I don't trust them. And I have many reasons, but that's just one example of the committees that are back there working with Richard Sprague to open up the assassination investigations. On the one hand, are keeping a lid on it on the other. And there has to be a conflict of interest. Now, what would I do differently if I were advising the committee after working 13 years on the Kennedy assassination and later the Robert Kennedy or the Martin Luther King? One of the things I would do, probably first or second, I'd start with Sherman Skolnick's research in Chicago. He is the gentleman that exposed the Abraham Bolden story, the Secret Service agent that was in prison 6 years because he went to the Warren Commission and told them of the plans to kill John Kennedy in Chicago in November 1963. You see, if you bring the conspiracy to Chicago or to Miami, where there are plans to kill Kennedy in both cities, you take the Cuban connection, the Castro connection out of the conspiracy story right there, and you put it right back on the soil in America where it was planned in collusion with the FBI and the police departments, because the FBI and the Chicago police were involved in this plot. And I would call Sherman Skolnick and then Abraham Bolden and have him be one of the first witnesses to testify about a Mr. Valley and about with his weapons that were taken from him when the assassination was called off, or about a car that was registered to a Lee Harvey Oswald in Chicago in November of 1963, when the Oswald down in Texas never drove an automobile in his life. The point is, I would prove that a conspiracy existed on American soil in Chicago and in Miami. I would subpoena the police records of Miami, the plans to kill John Kennedy on the streets of Miami with a high-powered rifle that was taken apart with a scope attached, and that assassination plot was called off because the police had an informant who told what was going to happen. Kennedy used a helicopter to go to speak there. He didn't use a motorcade because of the plans. But many of the anti-Castro Cubans that were involved in Watergate with their links to the Mexican money and the Republic National Bank that funded the Kennedy assassination money, all weaved together through the Watergate saga from 1962 and 63 up to the present day. So if I were running the committee or could get to them, and I can't get to them, and neither can the researchers that are meeting in New York, we can't get to the committee. What I call the real researchers cannot get through to the staff or to anybody in Washington, D.C. to get our information or our opinions on the record. Instead, they use the Red Squad from the New York Police Department that has already been known to be involved in counterintelligence. But the researchers who've done the hard work can't get to the committee. And one of the things that I would suggest, if I could get through that wall, would be to use the Abraham Bolden story and the Miami story. And then, of course, as I say, I would call Henry Gonzalez, the chairman of the committee, to give a full testimony on who he handed Governor Connolly's clothing and where it went, and then call the Secret Service agent and find out who ordered it dry cleaned and destroyed. Mr. Sprague has bragged that his ability as a prosecutor is par excellence because he only lost one case and he got 20 convictions, 20 death penalties in Philadelphia. Now that special prosecutor that's asking $6 million to investigate the killing of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King has been responsible for the murder of 20 people. And I would just wonder, before I hired that man with these great accolades, who the 20 people were who died, what was their crime, was there any controversy, who gained by these particular murders, and I would want to know the story of these 20 murders before I would hire Mr. Sprague. Why? Because I think of the story of that famous federal district judge, Irving Kaufman of New York City, who in 1961 was responsible for the death penalty of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And after they were prosecuted and killed, the two Rosenbergs were given the death penalty, Irving Kaufman became the chief judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Court in New York City. And he carries that role now, and he consistently blocks every effort to go over the review of the Rosenberg execution. Since 1961, he's had such power in New York City that he's blocked FBI reports that he was working with the prosecutor. He was holding secret conversations with the prosecutors of the Rosenberg case at the time that he was sentencing. So I give one example of how a judge won a promotion because of two executions, and I know that people get these appointments or get these chances to be nominated into a position of office to be elected because of misdeeds they've done. Not always is the death penalty earned, and I know that people who've been responsible for playing hanky-panky on all of these assassinations at the legal end in California or in Texas or in Washington, D.C. have been promoted. Not one of them has been demoted or taken off the job, but they were promoted. So in the case of the Rosenbergs, that judge moved from the district court judge to the chief judge of the United States Court of Appeals. That is a big job for the state of New York, and he was responsible for the Rosenberg death. So I see that Mr. Sprague, Richard Sprague, gets accolades. He's been called brilliant last week by none other than Jack Anderson, and nobody has put down the conspiracy theories more than Jack Anderson. He has put a lid on them. So when he calls this special prosecutor a brilliant person in the law field, and he got these forceful death penalties, 20 of them, you have to sit back and say, okay, wait a minute, what did Richard Sprague do in Philadelphia? Did he earn the accolade, or is this a promotion for a cover-up? And you can't afford to be too suspicious. This isn't paranoid, because it's a historical fact that people that do cover up these vast political conspiracies get promotions. And now he's in the hands of this hot potato in New York City. He has the Red Squad working with him, and in Washington, D.C., and he's asking anywhere from $6 to $50 million to go into these assassinations, and yet he's starting with CIA documents instead of the past documents that the researchers had available. So he's using information now from the CIA that they're giving to him, and not available testimony of perjury and falsification of evidence that is bound even in the government's 26 volumes of commission hearings. Another thing is that we probably will not have a chance to challenge his witnesses if they're perjuring themselves. The staff there wouldn't know the perjury because they haven't read the case for 13 years. So we will be talking about that committee, and each week I will talk about what's good about it, if there's something good, and I'll be talking on Dialogue Conspiracy about what's bad, and meeting with people in New York and getting out a newsletter about this case. Another subject I'll be talking at great length all year, hopefully, is the Howard Hughes case. I have a special interest in that, since 1974, when I published the article that he was buried in 71, and that's not his body that was buried in Houston, Texas. There are approximately 70 lawsuits now filed against Summa Corporation. 70 lawsuits. So you see, if I just studied Howard Hughes for 1 year and didn't study any of these other cases, I would be busy. And if 3 or 4 of these cases come to full court hearings, the body will have to be exhumed. This is the #1 story because it encompasses all of the other stories that I've done, and I've dwelt on the Hughes case at length because it's so overbearing and powerful. And I do want to talk a little bit about it today and then go back to it again next week. I'll also be talking on Dialogue Conspiracy at length about the Carter appointments, probably next week or the week after. I think they're a total disaster. I didn't vote for Jimmy Carter. I'm glad some people did because I still think he's better than Gerald Ford in terms of getting a member of the Warren Commission off the White House payroll, because any truths that come out have a better chance. At least he wasn't part of the old team at the time, so that's a little glimmer of hope. I'm going to talk about his appointment of Treasury Michael Blumenthal, his Defense Secretary Harold Brown, his Health, Education, and Welfare Secretary Joseph Califano Jr., Andrew Young, who will be at the United Nations, Burt Lance, Office of Management Budget, Mr. Brzezinski for the National Security Council, Theodore Sorensen for the CIA head, and James Schlesinger for energy. Each one of them is a total disaster in terms of hope for researchers. This is a team that just had to be put together years in advance. Probably when Jimmy Carter got out of Annapolis, that class of 47, I wouldn't be surprised, and I've believed for a long time that he was groomed and picked for this role. I just can't say enough about these appointments. They're terrible. An example is James Califano, who is portrayed as a great liberal. He works in the law firm. He worked his way up from the law firm of Tom Dewey of New York City. Dewey, as you may or may not know, was funded by the Mary Carter Paint Company, which was formed by Allen Dulles of the Central Intelligence Agency. He went from the Tom Dewey offices, or worked with them. He wrote in 1961 to Cyrus Vance from the Department of Defense and said, "I want to work with you." In 1976, which is 15 years later, Vance becomes Secretary of State, and Califano runs Health, Education, and Welfare. He also worked up till 1965 as Secretary to Mr. McNamara during the terrible White House years, the Vietnam War incident. and has been linked to the Central Intelligence Agency, the Defense Department, and now moves into the Health, Education, and Welfare. That's one example of an appointment. Another kind of person, just briefly, that I'll go into detail, is Theodore Sorensen. He worked for John Kennedy, joined that camp at the time of the invasion of Cuba. He works for the law office of Paul Weiss Rifkin, a famous law office in New York that represented Jacqueline Kennedy. He still does, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. He represents American overseas corporations in Iran, Zaire, Sierra Leone. He was the advisor to Robert Kennedy until he was assassinated. Jimmy Carter said he likes him for his loyalty. That's the one thing he didn't have, was loyalty to the Kennedys or to anybody else. Ted Sorensen is a disaster. Each one of these appointments is horrendous, and I'll do one or two shows, hopefully, on the cabinet appointments of Jimmy Carter. They give me the shakes just to think about them. And I will be talking about the trial of Emily William Harris, the Chowchilla trial. There's many unfinished trials going on and will be taking place, and their links to the Central Intelligence Agency. We'll have enough to cover for 1977. If we just ran down the few things that I'm talking about now, we have enough for 52 weeks. I do want to talk about Howard Hughes' story each week, a little bit about the cases, the lawsuits going on, and a little bit, 5 or 10 minutes, on the investigations in Washington. But next week, before the week is passed, I want you to buy, those of you that can, buy The Star. It's a small newspaper. It's called The Star. It's put out like the National Enquirer. And midnight, it's at the grocery stores or liquor stores, January the 4th, 1977. I want you to be sure and buy that before it goes off the press. It's out this week. Run to the store and get it. And if you don't get it, I'll put the address of The Star on KLRB next week so that you can buy it, because if you collect articles on Howard Hughes or follow that case in the future or my line of thinking, this is a good primer or a good start to begin with. The subject of this big article that came out this week, it says top lawman probes the inner Hughes circle, and they're suggesting that there will be prosecutions on the case of Howard Hughes of the people that took care of them. I have my opinions of why he was neglected, and that's because I believe it wasn't Howard Hughes at all. But some of the items that are brought up in the Star article, I'll mention briefly and maybe analyze a few of them right now. They said that for 15 years of his 70 years, he lived in solitude. That's exactly right. He began to be isolated totally starting in 1946, and then by 57 to 58, he was kept in isolation. They claim these people that are writing this article are 2 male nurses that worked for Howard Hughes up to the end that are helping James Phelan write his book. And then they quote the Attorney General, John Hill from Houston, Texas, and Rick Harrison, assistant. They said that Hughes lived in squalor and deprivation, experienced only by Skid Row derelicts. They said the top aides kept Hughes a virtual prisoner for 15 years, and they're now being investigated to be charged for criminal neglect. It says the allegations that the Mormon Mafia or the Palace Guards deliberately kept him isolated from the world, reducing him to a human vegetable. These are the allegations in the Star article, which I have maintained all along, but they still say it was used, and this is the breaking point, or where I'm working with the Texas officials, and I say it isn't used. They said that he was deliberately kept isolated and that he was reduced to a human vegetable, taking away, again, his own free will that he wanted privacy or was afraid of germs. They said he was locked away in a darkened cell. They said he was cut off from any news of the outside world. The Hughes aides manipulated him to make sure that their lives were comfortable and they had glamorous expense accounts. He was denied proper medical care. They don't know who signed his checks and the financial situation around him. And the Attorney General Hill says these are all unanswered questions. 2 male nurses, Mel Stewart and Gordon Margolis, said he was treated like a zombie, which is what I said this double was done. They had no regard for him, and nothing has been more shocking than this situation which the American people are taking, and you listeners take. I'm so outraged at it that nothing has been moving on this case, and I'm repeating now what is finally coming out just in this story that should make the front pages of the New York Times, but doesn't. They said he was treated like a zombie by those people that profited by his incarceration, that he lived out of the 15th century. He was a captive king. He was skin and bones like in a dungeon. They claimed that they had a better-looking cadaver, that they saw better-looking cadavers than Mr. Hughes before he died. Now, the two employees claimed that if there's any chance that the palace guard is investigated, one of them said, I hope they get their comeuppance. What they did was dastardly and horrible. And I don't know why these two men who were with him up to the end wouldn't be charged for murder either. They, at any time, could have left and gone to the nearest telephone and called the police. So they're blaming the entire Mormon palace guard and making money off of a book. But this is what they're telling you. They're saying, I hope those other people are punished. They said he wasn't chained to a bed, but he was a prisoner. He wasn't chained because the knobs were off the doors, the elevators were cut off. He had no access to a telephone in or out, or who went in the cottage or out. They said he had a dungeon in the best hotels in the world. Those included Vancouver, Mexico, the Bahamas, and London. The group around him held all of the purse strings. They only let him know what they wanted him to know. They knew how sick he was. They knew he was addicted to drugs. This aide said, I saw him inject himself. There was no move to stop him. The palace guards couldn't be challenged. If you went against them, or they would intimidate you. Whenever I tried to help the boss or treat him like a human being, I was treated by them like an illegitimate child. Now, that doesn't explain why a person would allow it to happen. This is like the Eichmann story out of Nazi Germany. Robert May, who is quoted in this article, is saying, in my life, I have dealt with gangsters, prostitutes, and espionage agents, and they all have more morals than those people running the Hughes empire. I wonder why the hell this whole thing hasn't been investigated. Those guys surrounding Hughes were like a government. Unto themselves, they told the U.S. government what to do. Now think about that quotation. Those guys surrounding Hughes were like a government. They told the government what to do. What reason is there for you to think, or for me to think, that they are not the government, that they still tell the government what to do? They are the United States government. They tell them what to do. They control Jimmy Carter through his Lockheed, Rockefeller, Chase, Manhattan Bank connections. They control the CIA and the FBI and Justice Department. They don't have to pay taxes. They get $1.6 million every 24 hours, even after Hughes was dead or this body was emaciating and rotting in a room. They only used his body to get further control of our country. This is the government. Nothing has stopped just because the body was cashed in. And Robert Mayo talks as if it's a past tense, as if they still don't have control. The article says there was a lot of money involved, and a lot of it didn't need Hughes' signature, and it spilled over the sides. The Hughes medical condition was outrageous. Nobody, according to this quotation, should have died the way he did. He was alone. He was cut off. He was treated like a child, I should say an abused child. The palace guard were furious if Margolis and Stewart gave Hughes news of the world. Well, I still claim that Margolis and Stewart, the book authors that are working with James Phelan, could have left at any time. They didn't have to stay with this man and watch him be tortured. They could have gone to any police in any country or called the FBI or the President of the United States, who the Hughes people put into office, to stay with him until he dies in their arms and watch him die and be starved off and injected and then claim it's a crime when these criminals are writing a book on it. I don't understand. Now, investigators are going into the case. A man named W.A. Jones, a private investigator, who says that he believes that Hughes was neglected. He's working for 42 relatives of Hughes. The doctors didn't help him. He had been on drugs, according to this article, for 10 years. And that date, from 1976, when he died, or allegedly died, to 66, is the exact date that I said that Hughes left this country and was flown away in 1966. I claimed that he did not go to Vegas, that all those memos that were sent to Robert Mayo and all that front was not Howard Hughes, but a Hughes double. And that double began to be heavily injected in drugs. The other Hughes was taken from the Boston hospital with a plate in his brain surgery. And this is where the split off, that I claim he ended up in Greece on an island with nurses and doctors around the clock. and could be used for fingerprints and so forth, and kept alive until he died in 1971, and I have alleged that he was buried by Aristotle Onassis in 1971. Now, that all the information that's coming out, whether it's any of these 70 lawsuits or new articles, pinpoints exactly my research on the Howard Hughes case. And so they're saying he was on drugs for 8 to 10 years. 10 years would be the 66th trip from the Beverly Hills Hotel where he was drugged and supplied drugs by the chief of police, Beverly Hills, not the captain there, Jack Eggers, and Robert Hall was one of the drug suppliers for Howard Hughes, who was murdered 3 months after Hughes was cashed in. That body was buried. Robert Hall was slain. And that's another trial we'll be covering on KLRB in 1977 with the people that killed Robert Hall. That's very quietly off the news. But the Star says he was drugged for these 10 years. He was incoherent for days. He had bed sores on his body, and he could have been taken to a hospital at any time. In fact, the Hughes Medical Institute down in Florida has kidney machines that they've developed that they didn't use on this particular case. Now, the mystery of the autopsy increased because Dr. Yeminowitz, I can't pronounce that, but that's vaguely it, the chief doctor down in Houston, Texas, it's JachimecYz, is quoted again in the Star article. He said, "I have been the medical examiner for 19 years. It is the rule that I get the autopsy report. I was promised that somehow with Mr. Hughes, this was the exception. This was the only time in 19 years I did not get an autopsy report. They were holding back on me. I know why they were, but I'm not prepared to say why." Now, that's the chief doctor at Houston, Texas. The autopsy was not done by him. It was done by a doctor that was flown in from Las Vegas, Nevada. And what this article says is going to happen is that the Attorney General in Texas may file criminal charges against those people for murdering Howard Hughes, and then we'll get the story out, because it looks like the law enforcement there is willing to exhume the body, and I'm very anxious for that to happen. Robert Mayhew said, "I think at last the shroud of secrecy is being torn down. There are a lot of guys around Hughes who are 14-carat phonies." Now, the point is that they get their 1.5 million every 24 hours. That's hardly being a phony. And Howard Hughes, the Star article goes on to say, died. One of the aides offered to spoon feed him, and another aide said, "If we start that, we'll just have to keep it up." And it was my allegations on Dialogue Conspiracy in 1974, 75, and 76 that there would be a turning in point of that body. And there was pressure. At that time, in 1976, Congressman Rosenthal from New York had asked Congress to declare Hughes legally dead. The Security Exchange Commission had a lawsuit, multi-million-dollar lawsuit, and wanted to declare Hughes legally dead. The IRS was going down. They were going to look for that body, and they had to cache that body, and they could have kept it going. And they may have had 5 more old men, 70 years of age, that were doubles from Skid Row or wherever, kept in storage, and could have turned them in when he was 80 or 90 if there was no pressure. And I believe that there was a lot of reason for pressure, so that they took this body to Mexico, boarded up the windows, boarded up the walls, had one Mexican doctor see the body just for a few minutes at 5 in the morning to assure them that it was breathing, so that there wouldn't have to be an autopsy in Mexico that they couldn't control. Then they kept an airplane waiting 5 hours to make sure that it would just expire legally on that airplane, and then the body was taken to Houston, Texas, where it was dead. This article goes on to say that Hughes would jab himself with a syringe full of drugs. Drugs were always available with no attempt to discourage or head off the habit. I have alleged for a long time, through information that I've had and research, that Hughes, that body, that double, was so heavily drugged that he wouldn't know who he was, whether he was a double or hypnotically told he was Howard Hughes. This person was drugged and kept dungeon-like in the most terrible conditions. If you can visualize Nazi Germany, instead of having hundreds or thousands of bodies, bones just laid bare, that one man was kept in a room that represented the entire defense of the United States, according to Noah Dietrich, as early as the 40s. The Hughes Empire, with its satellites and communications, kept stark naked and tortured and starved to death and drugged and kept in a room isolated for years and compared to a 15th century dungeon. That's the America we're living in. If you don't get angry, I don't know why. If you don't get outraged at this story, as I feel about it, then I almost feel that we deserve what we get in this country. And that's 1977. Have a good year, and I'll see you next week on Dialogue Conspiracy.
This has been Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell, who for many years has been researching the facts behind political assassinations and conspiracies in this country. Dialogue Conspiracy originates with KLRB-FM in Carmel, California.
Stop.
Yeah,